Ahoy mateys, this is Captain George. Welcome back to my channel where we explore everything that Little Italy has to offer. And remember to subscribe and hit the bell to get the notifications for all my future videos on Little Italy. Today we are at the San Diego Maritime Museum and I'm going to take you on a trip back in time to a time of pirates and booty and long voyages across the sea. Right now I'm standing in front of the Star of India. This is the oldest active sailing ship in the world, right here in San Diego. This has been sailing since 1863. So this is only one of the 7 or 8 ships we're going to be looking at today. So come on, scallywags, let's go and take a look. I'm here with Tyler Hackworth, the program manager of the Maritime Museum. Pleasure to meet you, and thank you for having us at this beautiful museum. Tell us a little bit about the Maritime Museum here.
Oh, very happy to have you here. The Maritime Museum of San Diego is dedicated to promoting the history, culture of not only San Diego's maritime heritage, but the maritime heritage of the entire Pacific Ocean. And we do that through not only our interpretive programs, but of course we have several historic vessels and a lot of replica ships as well.
How many ships are there here?
Oh, we're going to be going on a couple of them, but we've got, I believe, 16 vessels altogether.
Oh, wow.
Roughly half and half for historic vessels that actually did work in centuries past, and replicas that represent a particular time period or style of ship.
Awesome, great. So we're going to check it out. This is one of the best museums in all of San Diego, and Tyler's going to be our guide. So let's go. So we're on the Star of India now. This is the oldest, if I'm correct, the oldest sailing ship in the world, right? In terms of how long it's been sailing.
Yeah,
right?
It is the oldest active iron-hulled sailing ship in the whole world. She's actually been around the world, circumnavigated the globe 21 times in her history. And it was built 1863 is when she first started sailing, and she's had a couple different jobs. But the one we tend to talk about the most is when she was an emigrant vessel, taking people from the British Isles into New Zealand and Australia, because that's when she did her circumnavigations, brought a bunch of people down to New Zealand.
Now, there's a lot of people who have been on this boat.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And maybe a lot of people who died. Are there any interesting ghost stories or haunted? There's rumors about that. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, we've actually had, I believe, Ghost Adventures came on here to do a couple episodes, and people throughout the ship, both staff and visitors, have seen or felt things that maybe could not be explained in normal circumstance. But I will take you down to a couple different spots on the ship to show you the most prominent stories of paranormal or spooky activity.
So we're here in one of the coolest areas of the Star of India. This is a classic saloon, right? Is this the saloon of the ship?
Yeah, this is called the saloon of the ship, and or the captain's saloon. Yeah. Also, some cases called the great cabin. But this was the area where the captain, the first officers, basically really important people on board, whether they be involved in the running of the ship or whether they're first-class passengers, this is where they'd spend their time. And one of the reasons I love this particular part of the ship is this is where the most original woodwork is. This table is 155 years old. Those benches, the wooden paneling you see around here, behind us, the deck, it's all original to the ship. This is where the first class passengers would be. This is where the very rich people be, and I think it's the equivalent to one ticket for first class back in the day. It would be roughly, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars now.
Wow.
Okay, so definitely only a few people could afford it. That being said, the British Empire was so enthusiastic about getting people to move out of England and going into New Zealand that in most cases up to 70% of the ticket price was just comped by the British government.
Oh, wow.
Right. But the bunks, even though they look pretty small, they're actually about 6 feet long, which was pretty luxurious for back then, especially on a ship where space is always at a premium.
There's a little bit of history to this cabin, the first mate's cabin. Kind of a spooky story, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of dark history, really. I mean, all ships that are pretty much anywhere that's 150 something years old is going to have some black spots in their history. But in this particular cabin, there was actually a very dark episode where a gentleman, I believe he was an officer or even a captain in the military. He was not actually a member of this particular crew, but he was a passenger on board. And I don't know what kind of demons he had, but he obviously had some very strong ones because he attempted to kill himself by cutting his own throat. However, he didn't succeed the first time because they found him. The crew actually had him stitched up by the ship's doctor, and they put him in here under watch. But it's an active sailing vessel. People got stuff to do. So the crew had to go up into the rigging, set some sails, do work on the ship, and they actually had to leave him alone. And unfortunately, he woke up, found he was alone, and his demons hadn't left him, so he pulled the stitches out.
Oh, no.
And that time, he actually did expire. However, since then, we've had staff sleep on board when we're doing overnight programs in the education department, and staff who have slept in this room, in that bed, have actually woken up feeling hands on them, feeling really ominous presence, all the rest of it. It's been quite creepy.
Oh, heck no. I would not sleep in there. That is crazy. You haven't slept in there?
I have not, no.
Would you?
Yeah, I would, just because I do believe in ghosts. I do believe in ghosts, but I am still very curious.
Don't let the spirits come out, dude.
If this is holding them back,
I know, right?
like, what kind of sorry excuse for spirits are getting held back like this?
So Tyler, who's Johnny Campbell?
Well, Johnny Campbell is a name we have actually in the logbook of the Star of India, and it mentions he was actually an orphan that stowed away on the ship itself. Now, stowaways were not treated very nicely by and large because it was looked at as, you know, you're just a freeloader, you're eating our food, you're not helping us, you're all this kind of stuff. But Johnny was different. When they discovered him, when the crew actually found him, they decided to train him up, and he was a cook's mate. He ended up being trained for a couple different things on the ship, and quite well liked actually, until one particular time he was up in the rigging, up at the very top of the main mast doing some work, and didn't hold on quite as much as he should have because he actually fell the entire distance down to the main deck, and unfortunately broke himself so badly that he was in a coma for 3 days and eventually passed away. And the most tragic bit of all that is that he was only 14 when that happened, and that is recorded in the logbook. We have historic evidence for that. And Johnny is by far the most prominent of the ghosts on board the ship. Whenever anyone says they felt a little something, felt a cold spot, had an encounter with something supernatural, it's almost always Johnny.
Over in that area?
Over in that area, we've had some crew that have been up in the rigging, talking about feeling, once again, things touching them and stuff. But one of the good things about, well, my version of ghosts is they just used to be people. They're not humans anymore in the physical sense, but they just used to be people. Johnny was a nice kid and who just wanted to do his best on the ship. So I'm not particularly worried about running into him.
A nice ghost.
Yeah, effectively a nice ghost, and all of the phenomena that's been associated with him has not been malicious in any way. It's been like little pokes, little just kind of stuff a kid would do. Little tickles here and there, that sort of thing.
So what do we call this area here?
Well, this is the tween deck because, very simply, it's in between the main or the weather deck above us and the orlop deck, which is the cargo deck down below us. So this is the tween deck, and when she was an immigrant vessel, this is where the immigrants going from England, Scotland, and Ireland to the British Isles into New Zealand, this is where they would stay. Now, there were roughly 30 to 35 crew on board, but they were up on the main deck. They had stuff to do up there. Down here is where all the immigrants were. Now, how many people, just looking around, do you think we could fit on here? How many people do you think?
On this deck here?
On just this deck.
Ooh, it's obviously a lot. That's why you're asking me. So I'm going to guess a high number. To me, 350 would be pretty crowded.
It would be pretty crowded, but actually you're slightly short. Not too bad. Pretty good guess. But the largest complement of souls on board, once again, we have it in the logs, was 409.
Oof.
So 409 people in bunks that were set up and down both sides of this ship. And this is where second and third class came in. Even though they were all living in the same spot, second class tended to have a set of bunks just for them, just for themselves. So you would have an entire, couple different bunks for mom, dad, the kids, whatever, because whole families would do this. And third class, you had one bunk for the whole family.
They were packing them in super tight in here.
Oh yeah, and they were down here for about 5.5 months. They were only allowed to go up on deck a couple hours a week. Now, they knew that sunlight and fresh air and everything was good, so that's why they brought them up. And you might think, well, why did they do that? Well, it was a working ship. If you don't know what you're doing and you're up on the main deck, you're going to get in the way of sailors, you're going to get in the way of lines, rope, all the above. Big wooden blocks that are called widowmakers for a reason. And you're going to get yourself hurt, you're going to get other people hurt or killed, and all the rest of it. So you were only allowed up when it was nice, smooth sailing. The sailors didn't have to do a lot of work, just kind of letting the wind and letting the ship do her thing. From basically England down under Africa, across the Indian Ocean to New Zealand, everybody gets off, but now you have an empty ship. So then you go up to Australia, fill up the ship with cargo now because you got a bunch of extra space, you don't want to waste the trip, and that's when they continue to cross the Pacific underneath Cape Horn, which is the most dangerous place in the world for a sailing ship. Even today, it's a massively hazardous place. But they'd get under Cape Horn and then back across the Atlantic to England, and that's when they circumnavigated.
And it did that for like how many, 20 years, 25?
21 years they did that particular voyage.
So now we're on the HMS Surprise.
Yep.
And this is a very famous ship, isn't it, Tyler?
Yeah, definitely in modern day, anybody who is a movie fan will love this ship because this is the ship from the movie Master and Commander, starring Russell Crowe. It was filmed on board this ship. She did go out and was in the ocean while the movie was being filmed. And not only that, but this is also in the fourth Pirates of the Caribbean movie. This played Captain Barbossa's ship in that particular movie. She's also been in a number of commercials since she's been here at the Maritime Museum.
Very cool.
Yeah, she started life actually as a replica of HMS Rose, which was an actual British frigate, I think mid-range military vessel, that was sunk during the American Revolution. Yeah, on most ships you see that there's only one helm, one wheel and such like that, but the reason there's two of them is because the sea is really powerful. And the force necessary to turn these and therefore turn the rudder and help maneuver the ship, sometimes you need one guy here, another guy there, another guy on the other side, and another guy on this side.
It gives you more manpower to turn it.
Exactly. So you could have 4 or even more guys pulling on the wheel one way or another to keep the ship's course true. All right. Now, if you watch the various movies that she's in, you'll notice that there's people up here steering her, and usually the camera is catching them as they dramatically look off in the distance. Well, if the camera had panned back and panned down to this thing right here, this is the actual controls for the engine on board. Like I said, she's a replica, so she has a modern engine, and this is where she would actually be being steered with. Welcome to the gun deck. However, this is a museum ship, Hollywood ship type of gun deck. As you can see, I'm standing fully straight up and down, and the roof is quite a bit above my head. But if you look here, this is the actual height of a historic gun deck. It's only about 4 feet tall, give or take. What that does is that makes a smaller target for any enemies trying to knock out the guns. They have to aim much tighter to hit one of the guns because it's a smaller gun deck. But what that also means is, because the gun deck takes up less space on the side of the ship, you can add more and more gun decks, particularly as the ships get bigger. But this also meant that anybody who was on the gun crew would have to be stooping, would have to be bent over the whole time and either kneeling or duck walking everywhere because they couldn't stand up completely. Except for one member of the gun crew who was called the powder monkey. Now the powder monkey, actual name, actual term for the member of the gun crew who was the shortest person of the gun crew, about the 6 to 8 people whose job it was to clean, load, and fire this. But the powder monkey, their job was to run down the gun deck, get to the powder magazine, basically a closet or a trunk with all the black powder in it, and run back so the gun could be loaded as quickly as possible. Why are they so short? Because they were almost always a child. They were almost always 8, 9 years old, maybe even younger, until they eventually grew out of their job by being too tall, and they'd start to hit their head on the roof. But at that point, they weren't just tossed off the ship, they were part of the crew. They were part of the crew, which means they got trained up for other jobs, which was actually, even though it was a very dangerous job being a powder monkey, because to any parents out there, giving a 6, 7, 8-year-old pound and a half of explosives and telling them to run through a small confined space is probably not a recipe for safety. Life expectancy for powder monkeys was only about 6 months at living on the ship than they had on land, because almost all the powder monkeys were orphans, were street children, were a couple days away from starvation, and sometimes their families just straight up sold them to the Navy because they couldn't afford to feed them otherwise. But here, if they survived, if they literally outgrew their job, they would be trained up on other parts of the ship, and they had the ability to become captains. In some cases, I believe there's at least one admiral in British naval history who started as a powder monkey and worked his way all the way up.
So we're standing in front of the San Salvador, which is kind of one of the prized projects of the Maritime Museum. This was a labor of love for you guys.
Oh, it very much was. You're looking at over 20 years cumulative research, planning, fundraising, and actually work. We had over 400 volunteers put in a cumulative 60 years of work on this, as far as how many hours they spent. Now, the San Salvador is a replica. It's based off of the original 1542 ship that brought Juan Cabrillo here into San Diego. Now, Juan Cabrillo is the first European that we know of, came to the San Diego area, first European who met up with the Kumeyaay natives in the area, and it was his job to do exploring up and down the coast in the name of Spain. One of the main difficulties that we had when we were designing the ship wasn't so much a problem with the building, but designing it. There are no drawings, no schematics, anything of specifically the San Salvador. So we had to pull from all sorts of other historic resources, ships that we do have schematics for that were built around the same time period, drawings of ships, all of the above. And it took us 20 years to put it together, with all sorts of different experts figuring out, okay, this is probably what it looked like. Most likely it was built like this. It had these types of sails, these types of lines on it. And so this is the closest approximation to what a Spanish galleon, and specifically the San Salvador, would have looked like when she was sailing into San Diego.
Over here, you have the ferry, which is obviously the Berkeley. So she would go from East Bay in San Francisco to downtown San Francisco. That's 1898, everybody. She was not retired till 1958. She carried roughly 1,700 passengers.
In San Francisco, across the bay.
San Francisco, across the bay. And remember, that's the biggest bay in America. She was launched, you ready for this, in 1968. And not decommissioned until 2007. That's a long life. Her hull is special. It's real thick gauge steel. In fact, she holds the diving record. This is where the man stood who was, I believe, a lieutenant at that time, and the captain kept giving him orders to continue to dive. Can you imagine the strain when he knew the depth they were at, and he could even feel some creaking, and this is a fabulously built vessel. And finally, when the captain said, okay, bring it up, there was a big relief. Commanding like in the center here.
I can see the airplanes.
Can you really?
You can see everything. It's super clear, actually. It's perfectly clear. What? Yeah. Thank you for taking a tour of San Diego's Maritime Museum with me. This is a true hidden treasure in San Diego. So whether you're from out of town or you're a local, make sure that you come here and check it out. This is one of the best museums that San Diego has to offer. And also, make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to see more videos about San Diego. Thanks.